Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien, and welcome to the video quiz for Key Concept 4.1. We are now into period 4, which covers the years 1800 to 1848. So let's get started. Alright, so Key Concept 4.1 reads, the United States developed the world's first modern mass democracy and celebrated a new national culture, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and to reform its institutions and to match them. More or less, it's basically saying we were the world's first modern large democracy, republic. We were beginning to develop a uniquely American culture, and at the same time we were sort of struggling to match that democracy to the ideals set forth in 1776. Alright? So you had tendencies that were democratic in this time period of 1800 to 1848, while also having tendencies within this nation that were non-democratic or anti-democratic. So let's continue. Some big ideas, some big questions. How did the relationship between the federal and state governments change during this time? Or more accurately, the national and state governments, how did it change during this time? How did various reform movements change society in this time? This is, by the way, the antebellum era, meaning meaning before war, before the Civil War. How did slaves adapt to their circumstances and create a new culture? All right. Key Concept 4.1, Roman numeral 1. The nation's transformation to a more participatory democracy, meaning more white men got the right to vote, was accompanied by continued debates over federal power, the relationship between the national government and the states, the authority of different branches of the national government, and the rights and responsibilities of individual citizens. All right. So first, it may be wise to talk about the development of the first and the second, or to remind ourselves of the development of the first party system and to give us a heads up about the second party system. So don't forget, the first system was the Federalists versus the Democrat-Republicans, all right, or Hamiltons versus the Jeffersonians. Don't forget, the Federalists were they favored a stronger central government. They tended to be supported by upper class, the elite. They were merchants and bankers. They were pro-British, and since they wanted a stronger national government, they favored a looser interpretation of the Constitution. Now, your Jeffersonians, your Democrat-Republicans, they were more worried about having a strong central government, so they believed the states should be stronger, or stronger than they were under the proposed Constitution, maybe. They were usually supported by lower and middle class farmers, although there was, at the head of this political party, there was a rural gentry, or a farmer elite, like guys like Jefferson. Full of farmers. They were pro-French, and since they wanted a limited central government, strict interpretation of the Constitution. That brings... I'm sorry. Now, both of these parties, as you remember, developed out of Hamilton's financial plan and out of the reaction to the French Revolution, or in reaction to Hamilton's financial plan and in reaction to the French Revolution. Now, the second system, and keep in mind, this video quiz is an overview of this time period. A whole lot happened in between the first and the second party system, which developed in the late 1820s, early 1830s, which we will go into. So the second party system, of which this is an overview, it was the Democrats versus the Whigs. And at first, these Whigs were called the Republicans. So you may want to take a note of that on this page somewhere. The Democrats were led by Andrew Jackson. He was more supported by the, quote, common man. He was against the bus, or the bank of the second bank of the United States, and other who he deemed to be elite organizations. He basically represented the de-elitification of Washington, D.C. Now, you also have the Whigs, or the National Republicans. They were anti-Andrew Jackson. They favored a stronger central government. They were led by John Quincy Adams. They favored, as you learned in earlier video quizzes, the internal improvements, and they favored the Bank of the United States. All right, so now we have the first two party systems out of the way. And again, even these two-party systems represent a continued debate over the strength of the national government. The Federalists in the first system, the Whigs in the second system, stronger national government. The Democrat-Republicans in the first system, the Democrats in the second system, maybe a weaker central government. Again, that relationship between the national and the state governments was contested. All right, now let's move on to how the Supreme Court strengthened the power of the national government during this time, often at the expense of state governments. So first we have Marbury v. Madison, which you may remember established the principle of judicial review. The Supreme Court can check the other branches of the national government for their constitutionality. In Fletcher versus Peck, it's a new court case for you guys. It was 1810. The Supreme Court exercised its authority to overturn a state law that the court considered in violation of the U.S. Constitution. The first time the national government or the Supreme Court of the national government ever overturned a state law based on constitutional grounds. Essentially speaking, the Georgia legislature had overturned a corrupt land sale, and the national government deemed that Georgia did not have the right to do so because it was a federal land grant. Okay. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Second Bank of the United States, essentially giving the federal government more power because it declared that implied powers do exist, that a loose construction, constitutionally speaking, is correct. Just because the text of the document does not say we can do a bank, the power is implied based upon other powers that it says the national government has. All right, so these three court cases expand the power of the national government. We also have Gibbons v. Ogden, which argued that Congress, not the states, can control interstate commerce. Essentially, there were a couple of guys haggling over who had the right to run a steamboat from New York to New Jersey. There was a monopoly given out by the state governments, a monopoly given out by the national government, and this basically said when the national government has a law that conflicts with the state law, the national government wins out, and the national government has the right to control interstate commerce, not the states. Interstate meaning commerce between two or more different states. All right, moving on. We're still on key concept 4.1, Roman numeral 1. With a growing economy, Americans began to debate the role of government in the economy. It's still a debate. Don't forget the Hartford Convention, all right, which ruined the Federalist Party. New England delegates were upset with embargoes and the War of 1812, which in economic terms cut off trade to Great Britain, hurt a lot of merchants and bankers up in the Northeast. And they proposed several amendments, including tougher restrictions for declaring war and passing embargoes. All right, so again, they were a little annoyed at the role of the government in the economy. Internal improvements was a big debate, remember, from this time. Debate over the role of the national government in intra-state improvements. For example, Henry Clay, as you will find out, he goes to Andrew Jackson. He tries to get funding for Maysville Road, a highway in Kentucky. All right, and Andrew Jackson vetoes it because the highway is solely that is supposed to be funded by the national government, that Henry Clay wanted to be funded by the national government. It was solely in Kentucky. So Andrew Jackson vetoed it because it was only in Kentucky. Although theoretically it was to connect to other highways in existence that went outside of Kentucky. But this particular construction would have been just in Kentucky, so Jackson said no. So there was a debate. Internal improvements. Should it be led by state funds or by national government funds? All right, now we get to regional, political, and economic loyalties, often overshadowing national concerns, or what we might call sectionalism. Excuse me. We didn't get to this yet, so this would be somewhat of an overview for you guys. But, for example, there will be a nullification crisis in 1833, where South Carolina, mostly South Carolina, they oppose tariffs of 1828 and 1832, believing that it benefits the North over the South. You're not supposed to favor one region of the country over another. The North can make their own stuff, the South can't, so this makes our bills, this raises our bills, the cost of the goods we buy. All right. So South Carolina claimed they could nullify the tariff. The national government enacted this tariff. South Carolina said, we can interpose ourselves. We can go in between the national government and the people, and we can block the tariff. All right. South Carolina threatened to secede if Jackson made them collect or tried to make them collect the tariff. And you see the devilishly handsome John Calhoun, who was Jackson's VP, and he wound up writing the document that inspired South Carolina to claim they can nullify this tariff. So Jackson's own vice president does this. All right. Also, don't forget, during this time frame about national versus state, who should be stronger, we had the very famous Webster and Hayne debates in the U.S. Senate, where Webster promotes nationalism over sectionalism over the states. Hayne argues the opposite. And these were very well-known debates that took place during this period. And again, these two things are an overview. We will go more into it in a subsequent video quiz. I just want you to remember that these are things that represent the debate of national versus state during this time. All right, now we get to the question, why did many whites in the South associate their regional identity through pride in slavery? All right, don't forget that wealthy whites saw themselves as aristocrats, as father figures in the South. Also, owning slaves to them was a symbol of wealth. They took their paternal roles, their self-proclaimed paternal roles, very seriously. All right, they thought that their slaves, the women on their plantation, their wives, were all their responsibility to oversee. Now, since 75% of the South never owned a slave in their life, more or less, why did they support it? Well, it's that psychological wage W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of. Many poor whites favored slavery and racism, since they, the poor whites, were higher on the social order in society. So they got no real wage, it was a psychological wage. Let's move on.